Today's episode of Off the Timeline is titled Georgia Tech Left the ACC First and Still Lost. What if, in 2001, Georgia Tech made a decision that most schools were too scared to make? They left early. They chased stability. They chose money, leverage, and long term safety. And 25 years later, they are financially secure, structurally trapped, and permanently behind the sport they unsuccessfully attempted to outrun. This is the story of how Georgia Tech escaped first and still lost. But first, we need to set the table to explain why this was a reasonable decision in the first place. In the early 2000s, college football still felt negotiable. Conferences were not locked. TV money wasn't hardened, and Georgia Tech still believed it could shape its own future. The ACC felt fragile. Florida State carried the league. Basketball drove priorities, and Georgia Tech worried it was anchoring itself to instability. So when the SEC quietly opened a door, Georgia Tech walked through it. No press conference drama, no betrayal speeches, just alignment. On paper, this makes sense. The SEC meant revenue certainty. It meant protecting the Georgia rivalry. It meant Atlanta's media market mattered. Georgia Tech didn't leave in panic. They left calmly. That's what this makes this story so dangerous. And that, sets up the first misread. Georgia Tech didn't fail because of this move or they made a bad hire. They failed because of timing. The early 2000s, coaching choice prioritized stability over disruption. A professional system controlled football, respectable losses. And for a moment, that worked. 6 wins, 7 wins, bowls that felt fine. But while Georgia Tech was stabilizing, the sport was accelerating. Spread offenses arrived. Tempo became leverage. Athletic mismatches widened. Georgia Tech didn't fall behind overnight. They just stopped keeping up. And what about life in the SEC? By the late 2000s, Georgia Tech wasn't bad, which was the problem. In the SEC, being fine is a liability. They weren't embarrassing. They weren't threatening. They became run-of-the-mill schedule texture. The Atlanta talent base, well, it slipped through their fingers. Georgia recruited over them all day. Florida ignored them. Auburn outpaced them. Georgia Tech became the kind of team that, quote unquote, played hard, which is a nicer way of saying no one was afraid of them. And that sets the table for the late modernization. Around 2013, Georgia Tech finally says the words out loud. We have to modernize. They pivoted to spread concepts. They talked efficiency. They embraced innovation. And for one season, it looked like it worked. 7 wins, upset scares, hope. But by then, the SEC had already moved on. Georgia Tech was not ahead of the curve. They were copying the previous version of it. Modernizing late doesn't make you modern. It makes you average. And that sets the table for the door that never opened. As frustration grew, Georgia Tech explored another exit. The Big Ten. Academics aligned, media footprint made sense, Atlanta mattered. For a moment, it felt possible, but the Big Ten hesitated. Georgia Tech wasn't failing, but it wasn't indispensable either. The answer came quietly. No, that was the last door. And it never reopened, which sets the stage to the last out of the box move. In 2017, Georgia Tech finally hit the panic button. They hired volatility. They hired offense. They hired chaos. The games got loud again. Upsets happened. Blowouts followed. Defense disappeared. For a moment, Georgia Tech was fun. But fun does not help you win the SEC. By the time the 12-team playoff arrived, Georgia Tech was boxed in. Too good to reset, not good enough to matter. 8 wins meant nothing. 6 wins felt exhausting. There are always one tier below relevance, and that sets the table for the cruel irony of it all. By the mid-2020s, the ACC collapsed in this alternate what if universe, and the counterfactual became obvious. If Georgia Tech had stayed, they likely would win 9 games a year. They likely would have made the expanded playoffs. They would have likely anchored a weakened league. Instead, they were safe. Safe in the SEC, safe in revenue, safe from collapse, and permanently stuck in mediocrity. Georgia Tech didn't make the wrong decision. They made the right decision too early without knowing how unforgiving the future would be. Georgia Tech escaped instability before anyone else knew to run, and when the rest of college football followed, there was nowhere left for them to go. If you like stories where institutions make reasonable choices that quietly reshape everything, like, subscribe, and tell me which school you want to put under the microscope next. Because the scariest futures aren't built by mistakes, they're built by decisions that make perfect sense at the time.